I wanted to start today with the whole basis of what we do and what makes a good engineer, what separates the good ones from the bad ones. And the main thing is that in the course of a day, as a recording engineer or as a mixer, you make thousands of decisions. None of those decisions makes a big deal. In fact, most of those decisions are decisions that start out being very, very minor differences between, say, whether you use a condenser mic or whether you use a dynamic mic. Let's say whether you use a mic, an analog mic pre. That's Class A, or whether you use a mic pre that has various and sundry harmonic indicators on it and so forth. Whether you use a compressor or you don't use a compressor, whether you use an equalizer or not an equalizer, whether if you do, you equalize before the compressor or after the compressor. All of these decisions lumped together can turn a mediocre sound into a very good sound. But no one particular decision makes a big difference, except for one. Choosing whether to go analog or digital. That will make a big difference. And I'm going to spend a lot of time today explaining to you why the choice of going digital is a much better choice than going analog, and I'm going to give you some examples. But I wanted to start out because there was a drum kit here today, and I didn't really plan on this, but I thought I'd do this just to impart some of what I think about when I'm recording before we get to the mixing side, what I think about when I'm miking an instrument or miking a drum kit or miking an orchestra. Here we have a drum set and what appears to be a standard miking technique of overheads, bass drum, and snare. Now, I was a drummer, and the one thing you notice as a drummer is when you listen to a drum set on a mix, generally speaking, if it's in stereo, the bass drum and the snare are in the center. The hi-hat is kind of in the center. The overheads are split left and right, and the toms are split going across this way. I always mic a drum kit from the audience perspective. Some people mic it from the drummer's perspective. That's your choice. I prefer to hear it from the audience, but if you like hearing it from where the drummer sits, that's fine. Here's the problem. Most people don't think about what they're doing when they put those overhead mics up. They simply look at the kit and they say, okay, let's put this here and let's put this here, not realizing there's a lot more involved in this than they think. Sometimes it's because of lack of experience, or sometimes it's just because they've never bothered to look deeply into it. But over the course of time, you start to realize that at least 30, 40, 50, maybe even 60% of the sound that you're looking for in a nice open drum kit is going to come from these two mics. Because when no one listens to a drum like this, so the mics that are here aren't the real sound of the drum. The sound of the drum is what happens after it gets to bloom a little bit. So these are the mics or room mics that add to the ability to feel the drum kit and to hear what it sounds like with power. Because down here, it sounds a little small. So the mics that are here are for boosting level and giving you a little bit of direct sound, but these are the mics that give you the sound of the drums. The problem is, the way this was mic'd now, let's look at where these two mics are placed, and instead of using our ears, let's use our eyes to see what each mic is picking up. If you look at this mic in a cardioid pattern, it's picking up this kind of in the center. This, the hi-hat, is all the way over to the left. The snare drum is right below it. So anything directly below it or to this side is going to appear, if you split it left and right, all the way to the left. So your snare drum, your cymbal, and your hi-hat are all the way over here. This microphone is facing at this middle tom here. So anything from here over is going to appear all the way to the other side, to the right. Or if you mic it the way I do, from audience perspective, to the left. But in any event, if we look at this visually, we realize that the panning that these mics are picking up is nothing like what you're going to pan your drums like, which is snare drum in the center, bass drum in the center, probably hi-hat in the center, and then these spread out. The way this is going to be is snare drum to the left, hi-hat to the left, bass drum in the center, and then these two toms all the way to the right. So what's going to happen is your overhead mics are going to be fighting your direct mics in the panning position. In other words, your hi-hat, which you're putting in the center, is coming up left here, okay, as is your hi-hat, as is your snare drum. So what you're doing here and what you're doing with the overheads are two different things. They're not complementing each other. Now, in a snare drum, which is a small amount of space, it's an issue. But imagine now bringing that across a whole orchestra. It's the same thing. What you have to do when you're miking a snare drum or a drum kit or an orchestra, you have to mic it realizing what you're going to eventually do and make all of those things complementary. Because if you're going to put something on the right but it appears on the left, it's going to smear the sound. Your ears won't do that when listening to it, and you don't want to do that in your mix either. So in this particular case, what you would want to do is you'd want to look at this drum kit and say, I want this in the center, I want that in the center, and this in the center. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to move this overhead over here. And now I'm going to take this, because I want these in the center. You can use this, which is a ruler, or you can use a cable. I use a microphone cable. You just go to the capsule, to the center of the snare drum. That says 42. And then you do the same thing here. That's till that is 42. And now the sound that's coming to these two microphones is equal from this drum. That means it's going to appear in the center. Same thing here. So now what the overheads see, this now appears left. The right appears kind of in the center. The hi-hat is going to appear slightly left, but not full left, because full left is over here. And your drums are now going to appear more across the sound stage. This is a concept that, and if you use more microphones, again, it's the idea of making everything work with everything else. So if you just listen to these two microphones now by themselves, you will hear basically the kind of pan that you're going to end up doing with the whole kit. And that's the object. So that when things appear in a certain position, they make sense with each other. The other thing you'll notice is these mics, I probably have them like this, these mics are pointing down. This mic is pointing this way. That means that the phase relationship of that bass drum to these overheads is at least 90 degrees out. Now, what does that mean? There are two things to remember in dealing with phase. One is called polarity. The other is phase. Polarity is whether the signal is plus or minus. If you have a waveform, okay, an out-of-phase waveform is 180 degrees out of phase. That's reverse polarity. That's so when you press the phase button, you're changing the polarity. This is not a polarity situation. This is a phase situation. You've got a signal that's being pushed this way, being picked up by these mics this way, which means your snare, your bass drum, is just as likely to be, if you press the phase button on your DAW, is just as likely to be in phase as out of phase, because it's about 90 degrees out. One way it's going to sound better than the other. So, and the same thing with this, because when you hit this, it comes up here this way, but this microphone is picking it up across the side. So once again, the snare drum could be in or out. So you always check your phase buttons on the bass drum and on the snare drum, because those are coming at a different phase than the rest of the kit. And this is something that I always do. I start by checking the phase of the bass drum to the overheads. Once I get that right, then I go to the snare drum, and we'll get into some of that when we get into the mixing phase. Anyway, so what I have here is how many decisions do you make a day? In this gig, we make thousands of them. As you can see, there's many of them right here. The question is, how many of them are informed decisions and how many of them are biased decisions? We all have bias in music. Some people like hip-hop, some people like classical. People who like classical think hip-hop is shit. People who like hip-hop think classical is shit. These are biases, okay? We all have some people think analog is God. Some people think analog sucks. I think analog sucks. In fact, analog has always sucked. Now, you're going to look at me and say, come on, everybody tries to emulate analog. That's the whole point. We want music to sound better and better, so let's do it analog. Let's go to a tape machine. Let's play it back on vinyl. And I say, are you serious? Think about it. I think there's a bunch of Victrolas out there in the front from the old days. They got them lined up on their pretty impressive display. Think about how long it took analog, not even to sound good, to sound acceptable. Those early Victrola recordings sounded dreadful. Back around the 60s and 70s, we started to really get into analog and figure out what made it work. But do you realize what we had to do to make analog work? Do you have any idea? If a Martian came down to the planet right now and said, so what are you guys doing for audio? You know, and I'd say, well, we have this one system, okay? Basically, here's what it is. We use this tape to record. Now, the tape itself doesn't record well. It naturally records very poorly. So we've had to do a couple of things to make it record well. The first thing we did was we added a thing we call bias to the tape, because the tape and the audio frequency is very bad. So we boosted that frequency up and used a carrier wave to make the tape record better. Unfortunately, along with that came byproducts of noise and distortion, but if you tweaked it enough, you could get it to sound pretty damn good. Okay? The problem then is, so now, once we recorded it, we needed a medium to play it back on. And we found that scratching some grooves in a piece of plastic worked. The problem was that when we scratched those grooves into the plastic and then took a rock, a shaped rock, and dragged it through those grooves, we got sound. But the problem was, while we were dragging it through, it wasn't getting the proper frequency, so we had to boost the low end 20 dB and decrease the top end on the input to this piece of vinyl. But then on the return, we decreased and boosted the other way, so we had complementary curves called an RIAA curve, and that seemed to make things work. The only problem was there was a lot of rumble generated by boosting this and taking it out, and every time you played that disc, you cut off frequencies because it was basically a rock scraping through plastic. But everybody likes the way it sounds. So the Martian turns to me and says, "Are you guys crazy? You have to do all that just to make it work?" Well, no, we got this other thing called digital. And basically what we do is we sample things, like 48,000 times a second. 48,000 because we have this thing called a Nyquist frequency. And the Nyquist frequency says that if you sample any item twice in relation to the highest frequency that you want to reproduce, sampling theory says it comes back a perfect reproduction of the wave. So if you want to reproduce 22 or 24K, sample at 48 and comes back a perfect reproduction. But, so the Martian says, so wait a minute, you sample this, and then you play it back through the same medium. You're not doing any equalizations or distortions or biasing. So why are people listening to the analog? Because they think it sounds better. Well, I have an idea. Let me go over here. Let's see. Well, this is analog tape. If you look here, those are the signal to noise of analog tape, CD being 16-bit, digital, and then F2 extreme is what I'm trying to explain to the Martian. But in any event, you can see that digital has a much better signal to noise. This here is the bias that's added to the tape as we go on, but we've already explained that. Here's the RIAA curve that's added to the vinyl as you're going in, and then we do a reciprocal curve coming out. This is all to make it sound good. All right? Now in the digital world, we have what I call mom's cooking. We all have mothers here, right? Okay, good. Just checking. How many like mom's cooking? Pretty much everybody. How many of you are married or have girlfriends? How many of you, of those that are married and have girlfriends, how many of you like your girlfriend's mom's cooking? There you go. Okay? Perfect example. This is what you're used to. It's what you were brought up with. It's a sound that most of us grew up with. Just like mom's cooking. She may not make the best taco, but to me she does. Well, my mom's Italian. She makes spaghetti. But nonetheless, the issue's valid. We tend to take what we're used to and make that becomes the end result. That becomes the nirvana. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're going for. If my girlfriend or wife could only cook like mom. So basically that's what we're doing here with the analog world is we're used to it. We like it because it sounds comfortable. But in reality, right now, using The equipment that we have right here, without going to all of this analog gear and all of this analog stuff that everybody is holding up as nirvana, we can make better recordings than have ever been made in history. And you can do it more easily than has ever been made in history. You have the ability. When I started out in 1980, in order to get a good recording, I had to send all of my tracks through a 14-foot console that was hotter, so hot on it you could fry eggs, and then go to a tape machine that I had to spend an hour and a half doing the record alignment in the morning, every day recording, do a record alignment, a playback alignment, a sync alignment, check the bias. There was 100 different things you had to deal with. Then on your record, that was on your multi-track machine. Then on your record machine, your 2-track machine, you had to do the same thing. We did all kinds of tweaks and so forth. Nowadays, and all that gear probably cost $1 million. Nowadays, for let's say $25,000, if you want this, and if you want this, $2,000, $3,000, you can do the same thing, not only the same thing better, but you have to use these. You have to use these, and you have to use these in a very special way. And what I mean by that is you cannot rely on these. Most people today listen to music while they're doing something else. You listen to music while you're in your car driving, while you're jogging, while you're you're doing your homework, Facebooking your friends, whatever it is. The problem with that is that you're using music as a backdrop, as a soundtrack, but you're not using music for the real emotional content that music can bring to you. Those of us that were lucky enough to have lived during the 60s and 70s know what can happen when you listen to a music album on its own without a video. Most of you have never had that experience. You've never really listened to an album all the way through without either a video or without something else going on. And the problem is that you're missing out on a huge amount of emotion. And what my job is, and one of the reasons I think I'm standing in front of you today discussing some of this, and why I've had a reasonably successful career is because for me, music was always emotional. Everybody here, I'm sure, wants to sit down and learn what EQ do you use to put on the drums. Okay, what EQ do you use on the bass drum? What do you do on the vocal? What compressor do you use? That's not what it is at all. Isn't that? Never was. I've always felt of music as an emotion. The more you go to the emotional content of music, the more you go to the fact that music is a universal language that binds all of us together, Spanish, American, Italian, Russian, Chinese, Korean, doesn't matter. We all listen to music in the same way. It reaches us in a way that video doesn't. It reaches us in a way that art doesn't, that almost nothing else in the world does. We can all communicate with each other with music without knowing the language, without knowing anything. Because music touches something primal inside of us. Music is based, if you believe in string theory, music may very well be based on the same thing that everything in the universe is made of. A vibrational content. Music is that. That's why it unites us all together. So what I'm trying to do, without getting cosmic here, is take the emotion of what I'm listening to. and make something out of it. Communicate in a way that will give you that emotion. Now, I'm not the artist, so I don't write the songs, and I don't arrange the songs, although as a producer I sometimes do. But for the most part, my job is to translate what the artist wants. And the way I do that is I close my eyes. Because when you're looking at a screen, or when you're watching a video, or whatever it is you're doing, as soon as your eyes are open, it changes the way you perceive music. In fact, studies have shown that once your eyes are open, 70% of all of your brain activity is zeroed in on the visual cortex. It's why blind people are so, we have this fallacy that they can hear better than us. They don't hear better than us. They just simply are not distracted by the visual information coming in, which overwhelms everything else. And they zero in on the sound. Now, that's what I do when I mix. I can't mix with a mouse because I have to have faders. And the reason I have to have faders is because I mix with my eyes closed. Now, some people think that's because I've fallen asleep during the session. Maybe. But I can tell you this. I need to mix with my eyes closed because that's the only way to really hear the music. I'll show you a little bit of a study here. You know, this is your brain on drugs. Well, that there is the brain activity to music when the eyes are open, and that there is a brain activity to music when the eyes are closed. That's the emotional center of the brain. Okay? Look at how much more activity there is when the eyes are closed. It's a fact of nature. So, again, one of my basic tenets is you really want to zero in on the music, close your eyes. We have this wonderful thing called Pro Tools, which shows us the waveforms and all that allows us to do editing in a way that we could not even dream of when I first started out. But don't get caught up in that. Once you've done all the edits, once you've done all the things you want to do, close your eyes. Turn that screen off. Put the mixing screen up. Whatever you do, it's seductive to look at that forever. What starts happening is you notice beats that aren't in line visually. Sonically, they sound great, but visually you see they're out of line, and then you chop them up and you make them tighter. We end up editing the soul out of music because we're using our eyes instead of our ears. So I want you to remember that. That's a very basic, as far as I'm concerned. Turn your eyes off. Trust these, not these. This is where it comes from.